I was trying to think of how I would introduce myself or how I would introduce my talk, and I was remembering back when I was in high school, and I grew up in Elmira, there was a program through the Elmira Psychiatric Center called the Mental Health Players. It was run by a guy named John Edwards, and I think Notre Dame was the only school that did it because we had a more flexible schedule. So he would literally pick us up, and we had to be juniors or seniors, and we would go to schools, organizations, gatherings, and he wouldn't tell us what we were going to act as, but essentially as we were walking into a classroom or walking into a rabbi convention in the Poconos, he would sort of drop to us, by the way, you have AIDS. By the way, you're a teenage prostitute. By the way, you're whatever. There's always a little bit of a jolt, and frankly, I wasn't particularly willful as a teenager, so I wasn't a big drinker, I didn't do drugs. So some of this stuff was, thank God for after-school specials, where they talked about, you know, people who were living on the edge, because that's what I usually channeled. My freshman year at Lemoyne, I had a creative writing course, and I don't remember the assignment, but essentially I wrote about one of the experiences where I went to Blossburg, Pennsylvania. I don't know what the population is, but it's small. And I was supposed to be a teenage prostitute. It turned out that one of the people who was walking us around that day was my girlfriend's cousin. So that was a little awkward. And then as the day went on, it turned out that we couldn't come clean. Usually we would say, this isn't really our story, this is somebody else's story. We hope that you have gathered understanding from it. But because there were actually teenagers there who were part of sort of halfway houses, we couldn't reveal that we were acting. In college, I told this story, and of course it essentially laid it out as I was a teenage prostitute, and then eventually gave the punchline. And one of my friends remembered it. And it made me think of how talking like this probably has its roots, or some comfort in that, has its roots in that mental health players. I sort of exploded into being bipolar as a college student. But back then, this would have been 90 through 94, people didn't talk about anxiety or depression, certainly not bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, none of that stuff. I remember going to a counselor a little bit on campus my freshman year, but I was embarrassed. It wasn't, people didn't talk about it at all. So I didn't get diagnosed until 96. And it was kind of one of those fluke things. I was talking to a general practitioner, and he says, you know, you spend a lot of money, you kind of run, and then you crash, and you're depressed and can't function. Sounds a lot like bipolar disorder. So I tried an antidepressant, and then I felt better, so of course I stopped taking it, which is very typical. And I did some of that up and down for years. I had some great therapists, I had some really scary therapists who I was essentially counseling, and that was always kind of interesting. And now, because I crashed and burned, I have been a case manager, I have worked with AIDS patients, I've worked with adults who needed help with their literacy in a drug treatment center. I became an English teacher and worked with collaborative classrooms, so I had a special ed teacher in myself. And I just kept failing, and that's how I felt. It was every time I would try to do something, and I loved it. I mean, I'm super passionate, and I love helping people, and I would fail, because eventually the depression would hit, or the mania would hit, and I would be up for 3 days straight, and then of course eventually you have to crash. There are years that I have huge gaps in my memory because of taking medication. That there's one that for me, Topamax is a medication you can take for mood stabilizing. And for me, because of course everything's different for everybody. for me, that ended up leaving huge gaps in my memory. Literally, I don't remember conversations, I don't remember how I acted, but there are people who were seriously pissed at me afterwards. And it's really awkward. I tend to definitely take on blame even if I don't earn it. And so I felt doubly guilty because I couldn't even remember the offense, which is frustrating. So I had an opportunity to move to Williamsburg, Virginia. And I was living with my uncle and I moved down there and just got sicker. But I started teaching again because I got my master's degree and made it through 3 years, so I got my tenure, and then things started to unravel. And by the 6th year, I couldn't function. There's a place called Poplar Springs that's outside of Richmond, I think it's Petersburg, and foolishly, I checked in on a Friday. Not foolishly, I take that back. I was suicidal. Literally could not stop thinking about it. I have certainly tried it before, but this was so unrelieving, unresponsive to anything. I was alone in my apartment all the time. I felt like I had nobody to talk to. I was ashamed of the fact that I couldn't just pull myself out. And so I talked to my counselor at the time, and she suggested Poplar Springs. And I went in, checked myself in, and it's really nice in the front. And then you could go behind the locked doors, and it's kind of like a drug treatment center. It's locked. So there's no checking yourself back out, which makes sense because I was a danger to myself. And I was there Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday. As it turned out, my parents were coming to visit me for Thanksgiving. So they accompanied me, they picked me up essentially, even though my car was there, and we drove back down to Williamsburg and then to Virginia Beach to spend the week together. So I moved back here, and honestly it felt at the time like it was the lowest point. It was the lowest point for me because I found it humiliating at 41 to be moving in with my parents, jobless, and completely unable to function. No kids, no husband, no nothing. I had been married, it didn't last long, and I hit bottom. And then I got to go on Medicaid. That was tough again because I had been a case manager. I had taken clients to DSS, and I had to take myself. And then when I went on Medicaid, my counselor fired me because he wouldn't take Medicaid. He would take Fidelis, which is what you can get after 3 months, but he essentially said, we can't see you for 3 months, but good luck, you'll be fine. So yeah, I went to Family Services, which again, to me was really challenging because the people a lot of the folks who were there were the kind of folks I had worked with as a case manager. No judgment, it was just hard, and frankly, I wasn't feeling my best self. But I found a good counselor named Tasia, who's a little hippy-dippy, hippy-dippy, but such a sweet girl, and I had a really good nurse practitioner. And between the two of them, I started a journey, and I take almost no meds now. I go to the counselor all the time, and I've started taking care of my physical health because all that stuff, even though I didn't understand it at the time, all that stuff's interrelated. Exercising, eating, not so much to lose weight, but just to keep my sugar balanced because I'm also a type 2 diabetic now. Just getting out of the house is huge, huge getting out of the house, especially when it's sunny. I will admit that it's kind of like giving me a little shot of something because if I'm in the sun, I'm talking manic a little bit, but I feel like it's wonderful, especially after the winters up here. So, not totally fixed yet, if there is such a thing as being fixed, but I'm now a tutor, which means I can still work with kids. I am an artist, and I've become a face and body painter. I'm working on building my own business. I've developed friends and relationships, and I haven't totally bailed on people, which for me is a big thing. Still live with my parents, but we have a way better relationship because they actually can see the disability as opposed to hearing about it when I was in crisis. And so I think there's more legitimacy there. They can actually see and understand what's going on. So, thoughts that I've learned along the way, and I apologize for the last bit. One of the things I have found I think probably with any mental illness, you spend too much time in your own head, and that's dangerous. So you have to cut yourself slack, and you kind of have to talk to yourself in a two-person thing. So I did have one counselor who suggested I buy a doll, and then I could talk to the doll, but that kind of freaked me out. So my therapist suggested just to think of myself as maybe a teenager or whatever, so that I'm having that conversation, but you don't necessarily need a prop. Anyway, hindsight's 2020. It is so easy to look back and go, God, why didn't I do it this way? Or how stupid was I? But it's so easy when you've actually been through it to look back and see the mistakes or see where you could have fixed something, and that you gain nothing from beating yourself up about it. Nothing that you do or experience is ever a waste, and neither are you or me. The only constant in your life is change. Or do the thing you're scared of doing with a caveat, because there are stupid things we can do that we're afraid of doing, and there's a reason we're afraid, and it's a good thing that we're afraid. But when it comes to like standing up here and talking to you guys, I was afraid of this, and yet I still felt like I needed to do it. Being open about being bipolar, living with bipolar, that is something I was terrified of doing, but it has actually been very rewarding. There's no time frame on following your dreams. I beat myself up on a regular basis because I'm 45, almost 46, and I don't have a salary job, good benefits, a 401k, which are the things I was grown up in my house to believe that those were the golden egg, right? You went to high school, you went to college, you got a job, you got married, you had children, you stay married, eventually retire, you're a grandma. I don't have those things. And so occasionally those things drive me crazy, that I am not those things, or have not achieved any of those things. And yet, lots of people don't have those things, and certainly lead successful and meaningful lives. And I have friends who are my age who have just recently gotten married and have married the loves of their lives. There are people who adopt at my age. So I limit myself by thinking like that, and I would certainly recommend nobody else does that. It's important to be honest and kind to yourself. Honest because it's a double-edged sword. So sometimes when I'm feeling exhausted and I want to just lay in bed, I have to decide, do I really need a day in bed, which sometimes I do, or am I just avoiding something? Am I just feeling really depressed and I need to sort of force myself out? It's important to challenge yourself, but also be kind. Comparisons are odious for good reason. You shouldn't Venn diagram your life with other people's. Should is a bad word. Life is not full of absolutes. You shouldn't have, I should be married by now. I should have a job. I am smart enough. I have a master's degree. I should have a salaried job, but I don't, and those don't work for me. So the shoulds aren't productive. It's very easy to say those things to yourself and beat yourself up. And so whenever I start saying shoulds, I know that I'm on a downward spiral. I don't know if you know anything about treating depression, but when it gets really low, there are certain treatments that are pretty radical to me. One of them is having electroshock therapy to try to boost you out of a really deep depression. And you can also have a shot of ketamine, which is a horse tranquilizer. And for some people who have really resistant depression, those things work, and they can be life-saving. So I was in a very negative space, and I went to my psychiatrist and said, I want to do one of these things. And she said, Jen, you're looking for a silver bullet. I said, excuse me, I just told you I was willing to have electroshock therapy. And she said, but you're looking for a magic answer to depression, and there is none. You actually have to work at it. It sucks sometimes, because I really would love it just to be fixed. but it's part of who I am. It's part of my chemistry. And so she's taught me, I've learned, not even just from her and my therapist, but also I follow other bloggers who are working at being healthy. It's a process, and sometimes it's a daily process. There are times it's an hourly process, and that's okay. I've learned it's made me pretty damn resilient. Two last things. One is, I don't know if you know anybody who's ever committed suicide, but usually when people are contemplating it, it's at nighttime. And there's a woman I know whose brother committed suicide, and her quote is, there are no good decisions made after 10 p.m. I think that's a completely legitimate idea, because I'm good until about 10, and then I get overtired. And when you get overtired, you're less likely to reach out to people, you're less likely to use your most logical thoughts. You're not going to make the best decision. So it's better to go to bed, take a bath, take a shower, watch some stupid movie marathon, whatever you got, to hold you through until the morning, because somehow it's always easier to deal with in the morning. And frankly, there's more people awake in the morning to help you decide whether or not it's a good decision. And the last thing is that you're the author of your own story. We can't let that voice that is not really us determine our story. And I'm in the process of deciding that that's not my story either. So that's it. That's all I got.